This is Peter Dale Scott, a poet, political researcher, and former Canadian diplomat and UC Berkeley professor. My name is Freeman Ng. I'm one of his students, and we're taking a break of sorts from the Jakarta videos once again, although technically speaking, we've taped all the videos and we're just editing and posting now, but we're taking a break in the posting of the Jakarta videos to create this part two of our introduction to deep politics. The section of the poem that we just finished, that we just posted a video for, is probably the one that is the most explicit about the deep politics surrounding the Indonesian massacre.
Or in a global context of it. Yes,
right.
It's a survey of all the dark forces, ranging from those working in Indonesia to those working in Dallas, Texas.
Right. And so I thought this would be a good opportunity to revisit our general discussion about deep politics.
Mm-hmm.
Now, just to remind the viewers about part one, we talked in that video about the general pattern of deep forces and how they come about and then what they do in the world. We talked about how they often arise because some faction or interest within legitimate government decides they need some dirty work done, or they need work done that they require the expertise of criminal elements to carry out.
Can I restate that?
Yes, please.
That may be what I said last time, but what I would like to say this time is that behind the forces of government, which theoretically are all of the legitimate uses of violence, there are forces, the very rich, the 1%, as we've learned to say, who are not content to do everything through the government, but every now and then like to use other means of enforcing their will. And so these cannot be written about because they're not legitimate. So they become covert or secret, and that's the raw material for deep politics.
And then often these forces, they continue to exist and exert actions in the world after they fulfill their original use. And they complicate the world in all kinds of ways.
So that we have more forces at work in the world than the textbooks which are focused on governments and their legitimate use of power tell us about. And there's some of those discussed in this section 401. I mean, a good example, for example, was that, and this impacted on Indonesia, that the CIA wanted to have influence throughout the world. And because America was selling aircraft all over the world, and specifically Lockheed aircraft, because Lockheed and the CIA were very close because of the U-2, a system grew up whereby there were extra payments made on foreign purchases of Lockheed, which became a kind of slush fund to corrupt the politicians in many, many, many countries, including Indonesia. But what was special about Indonesia was usually these payoffs, these bribes, were going to high-level members in the government. What happened in Indonesia in 1965 is that the payments which had been going to members of the Sukarno government got switched and instead went to a general, Alamsyah, who was already supporting Suharto, the man who was plotting by this time to overthrow Sukarno. So it was the use of money, but it was money to support what ultimately became violence, very bloody violence, to effect a change of government.
Can you contrast the conventional wisdom about the Indonesian massacre with the more precise understanding you gain when you take into account these deep political forces, and talk about what difference that makes? Why is that important?
Well, it's important to me because I live in North America. There in the last 10 or 15 years, and particularly since I wrote Coming to Jakarta, there have now been quite a few studies of what happened in Indonesia in 1965, some of them very good and quite scholarly, but they tend mostly to focus on what was happening inside Indonesia and to focus on the Indonesians concerned, the makeup of the general staff and the generals who were pro-Sukarno, the generals who were pro-Suharto. But the question of American influence is still not very well understood. And because American covert influence is still widespread in the world and occasionally quite violent in the world, as in the case of, say, Libya. That wasn't all covert, of course, but it was partly covert. Syria, mostly covert up to now. We're going to have a world that is shaken by violence, that is sponsored by America, until we do more to bring out into the public knowledge that there are these forces in America which have encouraged violence in other parts of the world. So that's why it's important for me.
Well, the other big topic touched on in 4.1 in Coming to Jakarta is the death of JFK. And this is a subject that you've written a book about.
More than one, yes. Well, it's true. It's a bit oblique. I'm talking about shady banking connections, and that takes us into Switzerland and a bank that was laundering money for Meyer Lansky, and that takes us to some people who were controlling casinos in Las Vegas, and then that takes us to one of their croupiers, the man handling the actual gaming tables in the casino, a man called Louis McWillie, who I quote was described as a gambler and murderer in one of the FBI documents about him. And so I talk about McWillie's probably best friend in Dallas, a man whom he invited twice to Cuba in 1959, which was the year of Castro's takeover. And that man was Jack Ruby. And I think now, so many years have passed, 50 years since the assassination, that I have to explain to a younger audience. Everybody knew who Jack Ruby was in 1963, because he was the man who shot Lee Harvey Oswald on television, Lee Harvey, in the basement of the Dallas police station, an extraordinary place for an assassination to take place. And Lee Harvey Oswald was also famous in those days as the man who was supposed to have been the killer of John F. Kennedy. So that's how close we get really to the Kennedy assassination in this study, in this particular canto.
And what's the significance of having made those connections? What?
Well, Jack Ruby, both Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby were presented at the time as loners. Oswald was somebody who wanted to be famous, so he killed the president. Jack Ruby was somebody, they actually said he felt sorry for Jackie Kennedy, and therefore to make her feel better, he went in and shot Lee Harvey Oswald. These are very feeble cover stories. Well, the weakest part of the Warren report, which was supposed to assure everybody that this was not an important event, that it was just a bunch of loners shooting each other. The weakest part of it was their effort to portray Jack Ruby as a loner. And that's what drew me in, because I knew nothing about all of this at the beginning, but just a little bit of research, just checking the footnotes in the Warren report, you began to realize that Jack Ruby was not a loner, that he was an organized crime figure, and even that's understating it slightly. What he really was the connection between organized crime in Dallas and the Dallas police. And they had an understanding.
You write in the introduction to your book on deep politics and the death of JFK, that the question of who actually killed JFK is not the most important question, that people, both conspiracy theorists and their debunkers, are overly fixated on that question.
Yes, in the case of JFK, I've always felt, who shot Kennedy? Well, some gunman. But even if we knew the identities of the gunmen, nobody would say we understood what happened. If there was more than one gunman, and I'm sure there was, somebody planned the assassination. That's what you want to know, not who was at Dealey Plaza pulling the trigger. And so I said, instead, many people begin with the evidence from the scene, the state of John F. Kennedy's body, for example. Did bullets come in from behind or in front? And then try to work outwards to what really happened. And I come from the other end. I'm saying, what was the political situation in America at that time? Who were the forces that had become anti-Kennedy, and why were they anti-Kennedy, and how they could, and then can you relate them down to people like Jack Ruby? And I think you can. So yes, I'm glad you said that. Because
if you identify the individual killer, well, you've maybe solved an individual crime, but you're more concerned with systemic flaws in America that allow crimes like this to occur in general.
In the case of JFK, even if you had the assassin, the man who pulled the trigger, that would not be a solution. You would want to know who hired the assassin. Why was he there? What was really happening in the country? And among other things, what changes, if any, did it make to our politics? And of course, one of the things that I said from the beginning and was attacked for years was that Kennedy being shot changed the events in what became the Vietnam War, because Kennedy was seriously planning for withdrawing most of U.S. troops at that time, and he actually had begun the withdrawal of U.S. troops just days before he was shot. And that withdrawal plan was quietly overridden, and we had instead an escalation plan which should put ultimately 500,000 troops there. So there was a very significant consequence. I was pretty much alone saying that at the beginning, and now I think history is moving my way on this. I think there's more and more consensus that yes, whether or not the assassination had anything to do with it, the change of presidency led to a change in Vietnam policy and to almost immediately an escalation of the Vietnam War.
Well, I'd like to move on to some of your current projects now.
Okay.
You sent me a draft of an article recently about the United States' relationship with Al-Qaeda.
Yes. Well, I'm saying that we've been fighting publicly a very expensive and quite violent war against Al-Qaeda, which has led us to overtly invade two countries, Iraq and Afghanistan, and to indulge in violence in quite a few more, Somalia, Yemen being the big examples. And I call this a pseudo-war because what's really going on here, I think, is not a desire to get rid of Al-Qaeda, and my evidence for that is that key elements in what we call Al-Qaeda, key individuals who were responsible for violence, instead of being pursued by United States enforcement, have actually been protected by them. And people who should have been rounded up and arrested were being at one point investigated by the FBI, and then the investigations were called off because of what we like to call realpolitik, higher political motives that you couldn't talk about, that overruled the idea of getting these terrorists. And it's a very long article, and the demonstration is quite detailed. But to give an example, my favorite example, a man called Ali Mohammed. First of all, he was a terrorist. He should have been picked up in 2003 because he was helping another terrorist to get into the United States, which was clearly illegal. And the RCMP had actually detained him in Vancouver, and the FBI in San Francisco said, let him go. They let him go, and that freed him to go to Kenya and to arrange for the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Kenya. So that's an example of the sort of thing that I'm talking about, and unfortunately it didn't just happen once, but happened over and over and over.
We talked in the first Deep Politics video about the mixed motivations and the multiplicity of factions that can often be involved in these things, so that the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing.
Mm-hmm.
There, like, efforts to curtail the activities of Al-Qaeda might actually be sincere on some part, part of
absolutely.
Many groups, and then they get overruled by other groups that are acting on murky agendas. And
particularly a lot of people in the FBI were sincere in going after Al-Qaeda terrorists, and it was primarily people in the CIA who had the strong connections to both Saudi Arabia and also the oil industry who interfered. But it's not really as simple as that, because you actually had CIA people inside the FBI who were obstructing, and you had FBI people inside the CIA who were trying to get things exposed there but failed. Yes, I think the fact that America is such a huge country with so many agencies, that instead of this leading to a clearer and more unequivocal use of power, it does the opposite. You have conflicting forces at work in Washington. I think everybody knows that. And there are some people who describe American history as if those conflicting forces didn't matter. Noam Chomsky being a big example of this. He just says America is imperialist. It doesn't matter what's happening behind closed doors. But I think it matters a great deal, because public purposes are, I think, frequently, not just in this one instance, but over and over, are frustrated by the presence of these conflicting forces.
So you can waste a lot of time trying to affect change using a conventional understanding of rational politics. You can try to persuade the deciders and gather support and win votes on things, but it's not necessarily going to be what decides what actually happens.
Well, let me respond to that in this way. It's very difficult to affect meaningful social political change in this country. Some people would say it can't happen. There's just too many forces all competing, so that a rational voice added to the mix isn't going to make any difference. I don't want to be so pessimistic as to endorse that point of view, but I don't want to be so optimistic as to say it's not worth saying. But what I do think is clear is that one reason we are not getting meaningful change in this country is because we don't understand the forces that are at work in this country. And I'm not claiming to have found all the answers. I think I'm just scratching the surface, and in one area, foreign policy, coming up with some of the deep forces that have been neglected. But I would say confidently that if there is going to be meaningful social change in a rational direction, then we're going to have a deeper and more rational understanding of how politics works in this country than we get taught. And I have to say then we get taught in the universities, which I think systematically ignore what I call deep politics, and as a result are quite superficial.
You're planning to do some research in Cambridge in the spring.
Oh, if I win a fellowship, yes,
Okay.
I'm not sure I will.
Can you talk about the subjects you're proposing taking on? If you...
Yes, well, in large, I want to look at the history of really almost the last century in terms of the financial elements that underlie not just American politics, but global politics, and in fact the forces of globalization that have been changing politics so radically. And I have this, I quote in my book, The Road to 9/11, a letter that President Roosevelt wrote to his friend Colonel House just as he was taking power. I could read it, but in essence he says, "You and I both know that a small financial element has controlled the politics of this country ever since Jefferson. And here is a man who was born into the world of Wall Street with a social register background. He knew the people he was talking about, and he came into power willing to take on those forces of Wall Street in a limited way. He knew he couldn't revolutionize America, but he thought he could clean up messes in the stock market and affect certain other changes. So we had the New Deal, and yes, I think it did clean up America to some extent. But that quotation that America is being controlled by a financial element, I think remains true. And I want to see to what extent that has been true since Roosevelt made that statement. And that leads me to look at Allen Dulles, who headed the CIA, his brother John Foster Dulles, who for a while was the head of the State Department. But more importantly, both of them were in this law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell, which was the top law firm for leading banks like Chase Manhattan and leading oil companies like Standard Oil. And they got more power, I think, from that background than they got from the titles that they had inside the government. And some of the most powerful things that Allen Dulles did in particular, I will focus on him, were done when he was a private lawyer and not when he was the head of the CIA, and which had a law firm doesn't sound very financial, but let me add to Sullivan Cromwell the name of the bank that shared the same building and on Wall Street and did a great deal of business with them, which was the J. Henry Schroeder Banking Corporation, which is a bank most people haven't heard of. And it had a British counterpart, Schroders Inc., which also most people haven't heard of, but they were very powerful banks because of their involvement in international banking. They were not powerful in terms, the big banks here locally are Citibank, Bank of America, and so on. But in those days, international banking was just taking off. And the Schroders in England, J. Henry Schroeder Banking Corporation, were very powerful because they took more risks than the more established banks like Lazar's and so on. They actually got involved in foreign countries and did many things. A key to what they were doing was to arrange the America making loans to Germany in the 20s and 30s so it could pay off its debts to England and France, which created a kind of dynamic force at the very center of global finance in that era. And Schroders were at the heart of that. The Dulleses personally were at the heart of that. John Foster helped negotiate the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan, which renegotiated the way that Germany could get it back on its feet and start paying off its debts. And they created something called the Bank of International Settlements, which is still with us and is part of what I call the roof of the world, the level at which very important key decisions are made, which don't even get into the papers because they're too technical, but which are, I don't want to say determining forces in history, but very powerful forces in history, deep forces, because they are usually not seen unless we have a crisis. There was one time people used to talk about the gnomes of Zurich as if there were some nasty individuals there. No, there are organized forces of which the Bank of International Settlements is just one. And yes, that's what I want to study.
Well, I want to thank you once again for talking about deep politics for this video series.
Well, I'll be happy to do it again.
Okay, and we'll continue with posting more Jakarta videos, and at some point we'll dip into the direct discussion of these things.
All right, thank you.